All right, I think we got everything sorted. So yeah, it looks like the recording is going to, or has already started. Okay, so welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew, and let me just get my windows pulled back up here. And yeah, this will be this is the 8th class of our series, Paths, Letters, and Correspondences. So no preamble this time. We can just kind of jump right into it. Hopefully everybody's seeing the slides. If you're not, let me know. As we go along, feel free to ask questions or make any comments, and then I'll have some time at the end. But yeah, mostly today we'll just be trucking along with our correspondences and our next 3 letters. All right, so our first letter that we'll be talking about today is the letter Yod. It's a really interesting Hebrew letter. It's the smallest of the letters. It's written as just a small mark. It's easier to see if you have others to compare them to compare it to. But it's just a sort of small mark, and it's often taken as the primitive mark. You can see the letter Yod appear either as a component in a lot of other letters, or you can see other letters as like an extension of the Yod. Like Vav, for example, you start with a Yod and then draw an extra line coming down from it. You're always kind of starting with the Yod. And so the Yod definitely has the significance of being primitive, or in the sense of like primordial or originary. It's also the first letter in the Tetragrammaton, right? Yod, He, Vav, He. So it'll be associated with the beginning of that name and the highest portion of that name. Attributed to the tree of life. It's often put, to the Sephirah Hokmah. And the very little top point of the Yod is sometimes attributed to Kether. So it's an extremely high spiritual idea. Now we'll mainly be talking about it in its attribution to Virgo today, which we'll get to, but also be aware of its attribution through the Tetragrammaton to the element of fire. So we won't really be talking about it as signifying fire, but as a component of the Tetragrammaton, it does have that significance. And again, that's the kind of primal fire, the primordial fire, the initial creative spiritual impulse. And we will see some of that symbolism being also relevant in the way that we're going to talk about Yod today as one out of the 22 letters. All right, so it's a single letter, so we know that it's going to correspond to one of the signs of the zodiac. Its hieroglyphic origin there is possibly from the Egyptian hieroglyph there, which you can literally see as just an arm with a hand at the end, meaning hand or arm. And its Phoenician derived letter means hand. The sound is what's called a voiced palatal approximant. This is basically the English letter Y, at least in certain usages of it, like the word you, Y-O-U, the y, the beginning of that word. That's the voiced palatal approximant. So our English equivalent, generally you're going to see this given as I. Etymologically, it's related to I. When it becomes into Greek, it becomes iota, which is interesting because iota ends up having some of the same metaphorical meanings as Yod, like I don't care an iota, right? Like a draught, a jot, or a little bit. And Yod also has some of this same significance, like even in modern Hebrew, as something small or a detail. And so, iota eventually get the Latin I and the English letter I. But in sound, it's maybe more closely related to the Y. And then also because of the Latin I and J thing, J is also an English equivalent. But I and Y are going to be kind of your standard ones, your standard English equivalents. All right, so as the 10th letter of the alphabet, it has the value of 10. And now we're also sort of concluding our first set of 10, and then also beginning like the decimal numbers. So from this point on, our next value won't be 11, but it'll be 20. So we're now counting by tens. So this is the beginning of that. And so as that, you can also see some numerical patterns starting to repeat. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but because you can what in Hermetic Kabbalah is usually called theosophical reduction. There's another term for it in Hebrew, but we are adding the digits of numbers together. The number 10 here, you would do 1 plus 0, which is just 1. And so we can talk about the 10 as like an extension or an octave of the 1 and a continuation of it. So we start seeing the possibility of deeper interconnections between our numbers here, now that we're dealing with two-digit numbers. Though, of course, in Hebrew, you can just represent the number 10 just by the letter Yod itself, which would be only a single character or digit. All right, spelled in full, it is Yod, Vav, Daleth, which sums to 20. Yod is 10, Vav is 6, and Daleth is 4. Now that Hebrew word yod vav daleth isn't the normal Hebrew word for hand. The normal Hebrew word for hand is just yod daleth without the vav in the middle. But because of the Phoenician and hieroglyphic usage and the similarity to the Hebrew word hand, hand is going to be our basic meaning here. Interestingly, in modern Hebrew, the yod vav daleth is the word for iodine, though etymologically it's not related. It comes from a Greek was ion, meaning violet. But yeah, hand is the one to know. All right, and then we've got our 20th path of wisdom here. So I'll give you again Westcott's translation, since that's the one more central to the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, and also give you Kaplan's more modern scholarly translation. So Westcott gives, the 20th path is the intelligence of will, and is so called because it is the means of preparation of all and each created being. And by this intelligence is the existence of the by this intelligence, the existence of the primordial wisdom becomes known. And then Kaplan gives 20, consciousness of will. It is called this because it is the structure of all that is formed. Through this state of consciousness, one can know the essence of the original wisdom. And I think these are really quite appropriate to some of the meanings we'll see here, as this kind of idea of like a primordial wisdom is certainly appropriate. Wisdom in Hebrew is chokmah, and we've already talked about the fact that yod can be associated with the sephira chokmah. And some of this idea about yod will take on some of the significances of seed and also of the idea of the logos, not just the creative word, but also the sort of the reason or intelligence that infuses the world. And leads to the kind of the patterns of generation and all this. All of these things can be associated with the Hebrew letter yod, and I think that's quite appropriate here, or fits well with these paths of wisdom here. Okay, so here's yod on the tree of life. It connects Hesed to Tefereth. All right, and our Yetziratic attribution is to the zodiacal sign Virgo, which means literally it can mean the virgin, but it can also mean the maiden. I've gone back and forth with how important the idea of the virgin is, or whether it's more that she's a maiden. And I think there is some virginal significance that comes through, and that is important. Though we might want to think of it more like extra virgin olive oil or something like that, rather than being in any sense about sexual morality, but about being a kind of like an untouched sort of purity. And there is some of that. I've heard astrologers talk about that in terms of sort of Virgo people, that there's a sense that not that they're asexual or anything like that, but that or necessarily, but that they remain in some way like untouched by the world, either kind of stepping back from it and observing it, but they're somehow separated from the world. They're not like jumping in, right into the middle of things, but somehow keeping themselves removed from the world. And we could see a kind of virginal idea there of being untouched or unsullied by the conditions of manifestation. All right, so it's a yin or a nocturnal sign. And it is a mutable sign, and it's mutable earth. So this is earth, which is the most stable and material of the elements, but this is mutable earth. So it's earth in its most changeable and variable and transforming state, which is interesting to think about. It's a little bit, not quite a contradiction, but unlike Taurus, where you had fixed earth, where the fixity of the quality as well as the earth really emphasized the same quality. Here you have almost different qualities being mixed together. And some of that gets reinforced by this as being the domicile of Mercury. So this is Mercury's house. And it's also the exaltation of Mercury. Mercury is the only planet that does this, that has both its exaltation as one of its domiciles. So Mercury is extremely happy in Virgo. Not only is he in his home terrain, but he's also in his exaltation. And one reason to think about why he's also exalted here, in addition to being in his domicile, is that the exaltations are often places where the planets operate particularly well. And so if you compare, like Mercury in Virgo to Mercury in Gemini, the earthiness of Virgo helps to solidify and make Virgo's action more practical. Whereas in Gemini, Mercury can be a bit dispersive, constantly creating more and contradictory meanings, being, sort of flighty, endless multiplication. Whereas Mercury in Virgo can be a little more practical, more down to earth, more focused. But because this is the ninth house of Mercury, Mercury this is less about sort of going out into the world and talking and communicating, and maybe more about something more receptive, and so about analyzing things. So, and this is a lot of Virgo significance of being analytic, of analyzing things, often of fixing and improving things, by paying attention to them. By, Mercury always has the significance of division, in the sense of like analyzing something, right? Let me pull out a couple of my keywords here for Virgo too, like I've been doing. Let's see, what do I have here? So digesting, analyzing, diagnosing, editing, discriminating, details, maybe being pedantic, mechanics, the mechanics of either literal mechanics or the mechanics of anything, understanding how a thing works. Fixing, helping, optimizing, supporting. Virgo people are often said to be interested in service. They're generally seen as humble people, sometimes overthinking or achieving inactivity through overthinking. Though, again, the Earth helps to balance some of that out. Let's see what else here. Discerning, maybe perfectionistic. Those are all Mercury kind of significances. All right, for our magical weapon, we have the lamp and wand. Now, lamp here is maybe not so much like the lamp that would be on an altar, but more like a lantern. And so the lantern and wand are the weapons of the hermit, which is the tarot card associated here, and we'll talk about that more. Croce also sort of glosses lamp and wand as virile force reserved. And again, this is one of the themes we'll see a lot with this card and this sign, and especially in Crowley, the idea of Yod as a creative, generative force, but also as something solitary and something virginal. So it becomes almost paradoxical in a way that Virgo and Yod represent a sort of pure form of generativity and fertility, but also of infertility and virginity. So there's an interesting, so almost like kind of double meaning here, where these two opposite things end up coalescing. And I think maybe we'll see that more when we talk about the hermit. Also in the tarot, the 8, 9, and 10 of discs would be attributed to the 3 decans of Virgo. For perfume or incense, we have Narcissus. We'll talk about Narcissus as a plant, also attributed to Virgo in just a minute. We'll look at a photo of it. For our magical powers, we've got 3 here. We've got invisibility. Makes a lot of sense for the hermit, not being seen, being removed or distant from the rest of human society. Also parthenogenesis, which is virgin birth. Many animals or plants and a number of animals actually do have, virgin births, certain lizards, bees, certain plants. Of course, this would be the power in humans, which, again, we can take this as a sort of mythological attribution rather than a literal power to be pursued. And then Crowley also gives initiation, but then with a kind of question mark in parentheses after initiation. So that's an interesting one. I was sort of thinking about in what sense initiation could be attributed to Yod. I had some interesting thoughts, but I'll leave that one to you guys to meditate on. But yeah, it's an interesting possibility. I'm thinking of the process of initiation as being attributed here. All right, now we've got our color scales. So for our king scale of color, we've got, again, this will be taken from color theory. So just sort of moving through the color wheel in the order of the zodiac signs. And here we've got a green, yellowish. I don't know why they wrote it that way, but it means yellowish green. We saw last time with Teth and the sign of Leo that it was greenish yellow. So now we've got yellowish green. And for the queen scale, we have the slate gray color. And then for the prince scale, we have a mixture of the king and queen, so a green-gray. And then for princess, we have a plum color. Interesting, Crowley associates this plum color as a color of fertility, and that the other colors maybe are more virginal or more infertile, but then the plum color Crowley associates as a color of fertility and kind of the idea of the fulfillment of the idea of like virginity is fertility. So again, seeing some of this dual meaning. All right, for Egyptian deities, we have Isis, specifically Isis as virgin. Now, in a lot of, I can't find or wasn't able to find like Egyptian references that talk about Isis specifically as a virgin. Sometimes the way that Isis conceives Horus, from Osiris after he's died, sometimes that could be taken as a kind of virgin conception, though definitely not in some versions of the myth anyways. And she doesn't usually seem to be treated that way. So this is, I think, an idea that arose somewhat later. I don't know if there's like a Greek or Roman traditions about this, or if it's a significantly later thing, but there is this kind of mythium of Isis as virgin. I think we've talked about before the idea of like Isis as veiled, and the idea of like no man like sort of lifting the veil of Isis. That also refers to virginity, and we can connect that back to like the high priestess card that we looked at earlier, and maybe think about how that might relate to some of the symbolism of virginity. This is a Roman statue here of Isis that I used, and you can see she's carrying the sistrum and a jug of water there. Sistrum is it's a kind of a rattle musical instrument, but was also a powerful ritual object. Generally associated with femininity and with goddesses. All right, so for Greek and Roman deities, we have a few here. The first is Attis, and that's Attis. He's often depicted reclining. He's pictured below there. And he's a Phrygian goddess associated with the Great Mother, Cybele. There's different myths of his origin. I don't want to spend too much time with it, but in his mythology, he castrates himself, usually a form of madness brought on by the goddess, sometimes as vengeance for his like infidelity to her. He castrates himself. And so the priests of Attis and the priests of Cybele were eunuchs. They castrated themselves as part of their initiation ceremonies, which the Romans had mixed feelings about at times. But yeah, that's where this sort of virginal significance coming in here. We also have Ceres. Ceres is the Roman version of Demeter. And so the idea here is of fertility and of earth, the fertility of the earth, especially agriculture, can be associated with Virgo. And so she's here as an agricultural goddess. Also a Roman Vesta, who's a virginal goddess associated with like hearth and home. She's here. And Adonis is here as well, though I was a little unclear on what Adonis was doing here. I think Adonis is sometimes associated with springtime. And so Virgo can sometimes be associated with the spring and like the renewal of life. Though, of course, the sun's entrance into Virgo is actually at the end of summer. So I'm not so sure about that one, but there you go. See, for stones, we have periodot, and that's simply because of its color. This is Mercury Virgo in the king scale is this kind of yellowish green color. For plants, we have Narcissus. That's the Narcissus plant on the left. And some of you probably are familiar with the myth of Narcissus. Well, I mean, there's his relationship to Echo and all that, which we won't get into. But part of the myth of Narcissus anyways is that he, usually because of being cursed by Nemesis, gazes at his own reflection in the water, and then either sort of does this until he dies, or eventually on realizing, he sort of falls in love with his own reflection, which is where we get the term narcissist and all that from, and then ends up either like plunging into the water to try to be with his reflection, or committing suicide after realizing that his reflection won't respond to him. But it's this idea of being solitary, I think is the significance here. Also, the lily and snowdrop can be associated with Virgo or with Yod, and that is because of the purity of those plants, or the idea that they can represent purity. And then the mistletoe is an interesting one. Crowley says that the mistletoe, again, with some of the seed symbolism with Yod. Yod often represents the idea of the male seed, or the semen or sperm, and so mistletoe is often the berries of it, and the juice of the berries are often having a sperm-like significance. I guess even mythologically, I've heard at least that there's some Celtic mythology that talks about like the mistletoe berries as like the sperm of a. I'm not sure if it's a particular deity. I don't really know that much about the Celtic tradition, but you have some of that, and you certainly have this idea with Yod, especially in Crowley, the associated Yod with the semen or the male seed. which of course is not really a great metaphor, because an actual like plant seed that's planted in the ground is actually a fertilized egg, right? And so the male sperm entering the womb is not like really the equivalent to like a seed being planted in the ground. That is part of the mythology to be aware of, even though biologically we know that the metaphor doesn't quite work. And of course there are consequences of that too, of the idea that like that the women contribute equally, to the formation of the zygote, that it's not just that the male creates something that's just passively implanted, in the feminine womb. So there's, stuff to be aware of there, but that is the symbolism. There's also some interesting etymological symbolism as well with word, with, like semen and sema, and like, meaning, right? Like semantics has that same like sema root in it. And that's sort of appropriate to Mercury and to the hermit, issuing the creative word. For animals, Crowley gives virgin or anchorite, which are kind of funny. Also, any solitary person or animal could be attributed here. For legendary orders of being, actually, the other legendary orders of being for today weren't super relevant either. I was going to take that out and forgot. But he gives mermaids and banshees, neither of which work extremely well. But anyways, we'll just move on here. All right, then we've got our magical hierarchy. So again, this will be a zodiacal sign. So our first divine name will be one of the banners, of the 12 banners of the name. These are the permutations of the divine name Yod He Vav He. So we've got He He Vav Yod. And then as an alternate divine name here, I've also given you the divine name of Mercury, which is Elohim Zavaoth. Especially that's the divine name of Hod. For our Briatic name, we've got the archangel of Virgo, and that is Hamaliel. Then for Yetzirah, we've got the angel ruling the house, Viel, the lesser assistant angel in the sign, which is Shaltiel. And then, as always, there's a lot of other angels that can be attributed to, especially to the decans, to the triplicities, and so on. And then finally, as I've been doing, giving you the name of the heaven of Asaya, which is just the Hebrew name for the constellation Virgo, and that's Bethulah. I'm probably not pronouncing that well. All right, and then I just wanted to show you, this is kind of just the first couple of verses, and then I'll talk a little more about it. The Liber Yod, which is a slightly more obscure instruction from the AA. It's given to the Dominus Liminus in AA, who's gone through the elemental grades and is now drawing together everything, all the magical and mystical powers that they developed over the course of their training, into a single point. And so there's 3 exercises. This is I'll back up. So this is Liber Yod, and it's subfigure at 831. We've seen 831 before in this class, and here the relevant meanings are, in Greek for 831, are phallos and pyramis. And so again, the pyramid is something that draws to a point. Excuse me. You've got 4 sides that converge on a singular point, and then also the phallus having a singular sort of meaning of unity. And of expressive power, and again connecting back to some of this sexual significance we've been talking about here with Yod, but also the idea of the Yod as the point and as the original thing. So this is the book of drawing all to a point. Herein are described 3 methods whereby the consciousness of the many may be melted to that of the one. And I won't get into a lot of details about the 3 methods. The first one is a ceremonial magic method that involves basically banishing all of the Sephiroth until you're reducing everything down, into Kether, to the crown, and then possibly even beyond until everything is gone. Eliminating all multiplicity, reversing the flow of creation. Then there's a practice of disidentifying yourself with the parts of your body, and then eventually disidentifying yourself with the chakras as well, and the various sort of stages or levels of consciousness that in the kind of Western tradition of chakras. And so disidentifying yourself with all of those things until eventually the pure sort of point of consciousness or whatever you want to call it is left. And then finally, there's a version of Pratyahara at the end that involves methods for withdrawing the consciousness from the senses, and so returning consciousness to itself and to its unity. So I just use that as an example of the way that, the symbolism that comes out of the letters gets applied to, the labeling and naming of different, techniques and documents and things like that. It can be helpful to see that sort of stuff. Okay, so let's just spend a few minutes here. We started a few minutes late. So yeah, we'll spend a few minutes here on the tarot trump. We can see our color scales more or less. We can see the grays. We can see the green-gray. In the light there of the lantern, and that's being, the light that's being cast there. You can see that that's like the kind of yellowish green color that we've been talking about. Now, his robe, the hermit's robe there, I assume this is supposed to be plum. This is fairly red for plum, but I know, I guess that's how Lady Frida Harris understood that color. But I think that is supposed to be that color. So this is an interesting card, especially if you're familiar with the more typical attributions. We have a bunch of symbolism here. Of course, the lantern being one of the main symbols there. The idea of the concealed or hidden light. And again, this also relates back to some of what we're talking about the mixture of fertility and either infertility or virginity and solitariness, that it is the creative power, but it's the creative power sort of dwelling alone or within itself rather than in its active form. On the left-hand side there, you can see a sperm cell. On the right side there, we have Kerberos, the guardian of the underworld, and so this reminds us also of Mercury and his function as the psychopump, as the guide of souls into the underworld. And there's some interesting underworld significance that Crowley brings in here. We also see the serpent-wrapped Orphic egg there on the kind of mid-upper left, which is a symbol we've seen before, and again, a symbol associated with fertility and generativity. So an interesting mix, again, of different levels of symbolism here. And then in the background, we can also see is made of, I assume it's a grain there. I assume that would be wheat. Virgo is often associated with agriculture and can often be pictured, with fields of grain or fields of wheat are all appropriate symbols for it. This is a difficult card, I think, to find a whole lot to say about it. Even in the Book of Thoth, I think Crowley spends just a little more than a page talking about the card. I think that this is one that really demands meditation, to get at what these symbols have to do with each other and the real core of them. So, that's true of all the cards, that it's really meditating on them and spending that time with them that you really get to know them. But it seems, I don't know, somehow especially remarkable with this card here. But again, I think it's nice the way it draws, a bunch of the symbolism that we've talked about together. In the image of the hermit as the sort of the solitary individual, but then also as the magician and the creative power and the mixture of those things. All right, so let's just move along here to our next letter. So we'll move along to the letter Kaph. Now, Kaph, this is right? Yeah, we haven't seen any. This is the first letter that we've seen so far that has two different forms. So on the right, you see the normal form of Kaph, and then at the top of the page, and then on the left, we'll see the final form of Kaph. And so this final form is used whenever Kaph is the last letter in a word. We'll see four others as we go along that change their form when they're written at the end of a word. And all of those letters, the final forms go below the line. So I hope that's obvious that the letter Kaph almost all Hebrew letters are written kind of within a square box, more or less. And so you can see Kaph basically takes up the whole box, the normal form of it. But then the final forms actually extend below the line. And after this, we'll also see one of the few letters that extends above the box as well. But yeah, do be aware of that, the double form of Kaph. The final form is really easily confused with Daleth, but the way to remember it is just that the tail, the vertical stroke is going to go significantly below the line when it's the final form of Kaph, and that'll always be at the end of a word. All right, so it's a double letter, so we know it's going to be associated with one of the planets. There's its possible origin in Egyptian hieroglyphs there, the hieroglyph for hand, the Phoenician there, and you can see really in the Phoenician how the glyph for a hand becomes what eventually becomes like the Greek letter kappa, and then our letter K, and that the Phoenician there means palm of the hand. Its sound, again, because it's a double letter, we know it's going to have a hard and a soft sound. So its hard sound is a K, like the English K. And then its soft sound is a sound we saw last week, the voiceless uvular fricative, which is the sound of Kaph, right? So it's that kind of back of the throat sort of sound that we talked about last time. That's also the soft sound of Kaph, and it's the same as the sound that Kaph makes. So our English equivalent is K. Sometimes, maybe especially if rendering like a soft Kaph, you'll see it as like K and then a lowercase h, but K is going to be your standard. You'll always see CH for Kaph. For Kaph, I mean, sorry, CH for Kaph and K for Kaph. And do you remember that it's the hard sound is used at the beginning of words? So this is Kaph and not like Kaph. All right, so its value is normally 20, because like I said, we're now counting by 20s. But then when we're using final values and the final value is there, you know, when Kaph is the last letter in a word, it can also be enumerated as 500. As I said, I think it's almost more common to see, even when you've got the final form of the letter written, to still enumerate it as 20. That's probably more common than not, though you should be aware of both possibilities. Spelled in full, Kaph is Kaph Pei, and you can see that's the final form of Pei there because it's the last letter. And that value spelled in full is 100, which is an interesting number and has some important significances. Crowley talks about, he mentions this in the Book of Thoth and in other places as well, that spelled in full, Kaph as Kaph Pei, which would be equivalent to K and P, that K and P can be understood as standing for the Greek words phallos and kates, right? The names for the male and female genitals. And so those two things together obviously have a sexual significance. And you will see K and P used in that sexual sort of way, connected with Kaph and with the value 100. Though we're just not going to get into that any further right now. All right, so its meaning is usually palm, like the palm of the hand, rather than the entire hand. I didn't say with yod. It seems like yod as hand, it includes not just the entire hand, but the wrist, what we would call the wrist also. We usually don't think of the wrist as being part of your hand, but it seems like it was thought of that way in Hebrew. But Kaph is just the palm of the hand, also like the hollow of the hand or the flat of the hand. It can also be the sole of the foot, because I guess your sole is your foot palm, I guess. It can also mean other derived meanings from here, like to grasp. It can also mean scales. Now, this would be a scale like like something that you would weigh, like a weighing scale, not like the scale of a fish. It can also mean socket or hollow, like when Jacob wrestles with the angel, and he has it sounds to me like it was like his hip is dislocated when he wrestles with the angel. It talks about his hip being like moved from its socket, and that's the word Kaph there as well. But the main thing to know is palm, and then everything else is kind of derived or extended meanings from that. All right, our path of wisdom here is the 21st path. So Westcott gives, the 21st path is the intelligence of conciliation and reward, and is so called because it receives the divine influence which flows into it from its benediction upon all and each existence. Kaplan gives 21, desired and sought consciousness. It is called this because it receives the divine influx so as to bestow its blessings to all things that exist. So I'm going to see some disagreement there about the translation. Kaplan's giving conciliation and reward, where Kaplan's giving desired and sought. There's maybe a little bit of similarity there, but there's also some variance. But the basic idea seems to be pretty clear about this, something as the divine influx being bestowed to all. And that fits very well with the symbolism of Jupiter, which we'll see in just a moment. All right, so here is Kaph on our tree that connects Chesed to Netzach, which hopefully I'll remember to say. This is the fact that it connects these two Sephiroth is Yeah, it's sort of interesting for a few different reasons. Hesed, of course, is also relatable to Jupiter, is the sphere of Jupiter. So this is like the path of Jupiter emanating from the sphere of Jupiter and connecting to Netzach. Netzach means victory, and we'll see the idea of victory connected again with Jupiter in just a moment. All right, so our Yetziratic attribution is to the planet Jupiter. I think I did a fairly good job of introducing the nature of the different planets when we went through them in would have been like the third class in the series, so I won't spend too much time on that here. So remember that Jupiter, especially in traditional astrology, is what's called the greater benefic, so the planet with the most ability to do good. Compared to Venus, Venus as the lesser benefic is usually seen as bringing like the good things in life, the pleasures of life, comforts and nice foods or sensuality, these sort of things, where Jupiter refers to like larger or more abstract conditions, of being. How do I want to say it? Like bigger conditions of like prosperity or of like rulership and things like that that get associated with Jupiter. And Jupiter is always about expansion, coherence, elevation, and very often has a religious significance. Jupiter is very much associated with religious figures. Priests are often associated with the letter Jupiter. Yeah. And actually, we'll come back to the idea of priests being associated with Jupiter in just a bit. So the magical weapon given here is scepter. Crowley notes, interestingly, that the scepter doesn't count as a real magical weapon because it's just like the representation of power, and that as soon as the scepter no longer serves, it must be immediately replaced with the thunderbolt. That's kind of a funny reference. That the scepter here is something like a symbol of power, but the actual wielding of power would be the thunderbolt, which is what Zeus, wields. All right, in the tarot, this will be the 10th Atu, which Crowley calls fortune and is often traditionally called the wheel of fortune. Crowley just changes it to fortune. For perfumes or incenses, Crowley gives saffron. Saffron is interesting. Saffron is like an orange color when it's made into a dye, but Crowley talks about the inside of I didn't actually look at into this, but the inside of the plant being a purple color associated with Jupiter, and also the idea that it's the odor of it is somehow big and generous and fits well with Jupiter, where also Crowley was all generous odors. I also included cedar there as well. Crowley gives cedar as attributed to Hesed, the sphere of Jupiter, but cedar is a very common incense for Jupiter. And why I use it, I use cedar generally as my general Jupiter incense. And it fits very well, I think. For magical powers, we have the power of acquiring political and other ascendancy, which makes a lot of sense. Jupiter associated with rulers and monarchs and with power. All right, so for our Greek or Roman deity, we have Zeus or Jupiter. Now, this is a statue here of Jupiter. And you can see he's accompanied by an eagle, which we'll talk about again in just a moment. And you can also see on his left, on his right hand, on your left, he's holding a globe in his hand, and the globe is surmounted by, let's see, it would be Nike in Greek. What's her Roman name? I think it's just Victoria, I believe. The goddess of victory. He's often attributed with the globe, indicating his rulership over the world, and then is often associated with Nike or Victoria as well, as associated with victory and the victory over all things. Jupiter, of course, is also associated with the sky. He's a kind of sky father, and very similar to other sky father deities like Indra or Marduk that we can all include here as well. King of the gods, right? All right, so for Egyptian deities here, Crowley lists Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra is a kind of synchronization of the god Amun with Ra, at least at certain periods. I think particularly in Thebes, Amun is becomes so important to become not quite monotheistic, but close to that, where increasingly other deities all start to be seen as forms of Amun, and Amun starts to assimilate other deities. And so that happens with Ra. Amun sort of takes on the solar functions of Ra and becomes Amun Ra. And Amun Ra is the creator god, the king of the gods, and also a god of like fertility, and so it becomes like quite universal. And so it fits very well with Jupiter. Not so much the solar aspect, although even that isn't a terrible fit, but especially like Amun Ra as the king or leader of the gods makes him, appropriate or to to be like associated with Zeus or Jupiter in that sort of function. All right, and then for animals, we have the eagle. Now, we've seen the eagle before for Aleph, when we talked about the eagle, associated with air. And actually, we've also seen the eagle as the cherub of air and associated with the cherubic sign of air, right, in Aquarius, and the letter He. But here we've got the eagle, as the bird of Zeus, specifically, not so much as air, but as the bird of Zeus. That's a traditional mythological association of eagles with Zeus, and the eagle, as kind of king of the birds, makes a lot of sense. For stones, we've got lapis lazuli, and that's lapis lazuli there, pictured on the left. Also amethyst and sapphire, and all of those are being chosen for their colors. Blues and purples are very much associated with Jupiter, and that's our reasoning there. Lapis lazuli, especially in thelemic texts, takes on some additional significance, where the dark blue is sometimes seen as like the night sky, and then the flecks of, it's not actual gold, but the golden mineral that's found in lapis lazuli is like the stars. So lapis lazuli sometimes gets associated with Nuit, but here, in the night sky, but here we're just associating it with Jupiter. And then for plants, Crowley lists a handful. He gives hyssop. Hyssop is an interesting one. Hyssop is really a plant used for purification and for cleansing. That's often done as a preliminary in like religious rites or religious practice. And so through the religious aspect of its functioning, Crowley associates it to Jupiter. Though Jupiter isn't normally associated with like the cleansing or purification function. So I don't know. That one seems a little funny to me. Also, the oak, oak as the kind of king of the trees, the big, strong, long-lived tree. He also gives poplar and fig. Trying to remember exactly what he says about them. The poplar can be very tall, and Crowley kind of associates the quality of the wood and the bark of both of those trees with Jupiter. I forget exactly how he explains that, but you can look it up in his notes in 777. He also associates arnica and the opium poppy with Jupiter, and both of those are for the reasons of being pain-killing. And especially the opium poppy as well has the idea of like expanding and elevating the mind. And then also cedar as well especially as an incense, is traditionally associated with Jupiter, and so the cedar tree could also be associated here. All right, for our color scales, for our king scale, we've got violet. Violet is a color. Violets and purples are often associated with either religious functionaries, high priests, kings. For a long time, the purple dyes are the most expensive and the most rare and the most difficult to make, and so they're associated with royalty for that reason. The blue that we see in the queen scale, again, similar significances, also the blue of the sky, of course. And then in the prince scale, we've got rich purple, which I did as just kind of slightly on the side of violet, a deep sort of violet, but like close to an ultramarine. Again, I'm a lot of these color scales, I'm sort of doing my best to guess what they would be or to understand what they would be. So that was where I decided to put that one. And then for our princess scale, we now have a bright blue and it's rayed yellow. And interestingly, Crowley talks about this one in the raying yellow as being the yellow rays being like the reward or the response of the holy guardian angel to like Jupiterian prayer, so that by engaging in religious rites and ritual and prayer, the response to the holy guardian angel is this this yellow rays or the lights, which I thought was a nice interpretation. But again, we see this. The main thing here is just this violet and blue colors that we've already seen. All right, and then we've got our magical hierarchy for Jupiter. Now, magical hierarchy is going to be a little bit different now because we're back to, after a run of zodiacal attributed letters, we've now back to a planetary letter. So our divine name for Atzluth will be El. Now, this is most specifically the divine name of Chesed. El is, well, it's really interesting for a lot of different reasons. El is a kind of generic name for like God or Lord, usually coming out of like Semitic languages. It can be associated with water, though here we're using it just as the divine name of Jupiter. Then we've got the archangel of Jupiter, Zadkiel. And then we've got a trinity here for our Yetziratic hierarchy, like we did with the other planets that we've seen. So our planetary angel is Sahiel, our planetary intelligence is Yophiel, and our planetary spirit is Hismael. In 777, the spelling of Yophiel, Crowley drops the Aleph. He just spells it Yod Vav Pei Yod Lamed. Eshelman corrects that in 776.5. He corrects that by adding the Aleph in, and other sources I was able to find of that name, like prior to the writing of 777, also include the Aleph. So I think that was just an error in the in 777. But you might want to look into that for yourself. And then finally, our heaven of Asaya is the Hebrew name for the planet Jupiter, and that's Zadek. Now you can see we've got Zadek and Zadekiel, right? The archangel. The archangel's name is coming right from the name for Jupiter. And Zadek means something like righteousness. And Zadik, which is, you see Zadek is spelled Zadi Daleth Kof. If we add a Yod in there, so Zadi Daleth Yod Kof, that's the word meaning Zadek. Which means something like saint or holy person. It's a particularly important word in the, I'm completely blanking on the name, Jewish sort of popular mystical tradition. Anyways, but the idea of the Zadok as a kind of Jewish holy man. So one of the things I thought was interesting about this was that in Indian astrology, the planet Jupiter is often referred to as Guru, and so both in Hebrew and in Indian and in Sanskrit, you have the planet Jupiter being referred to with names of a religious leader, either a guru or a zadok, and so it's again bringing in this idea of the priestly function associated with Jupiter. Yeah, and again, we can see that both in the name of the heaven of Messiah and in the archangel as well. Okay, so here's our tarot card here. This is Atu 10, which is Fortune, and the esoteric title is The Lord of the Forces of Life. All right, so interesting stuff going on here. First of all, with the color scales, pretty straightforward. We see a lot of these, blues or deep purples and violets and blues in the background. And then a lot of the figures upon it we see in the yellow color, the yellow rayed. So this really emphasizes, the yellow, but I think that was an artistic necessity, right? If everything was just these deep purples and blues, it wouldn't be a very good image. So there's a lot of yellow here for contrast. Of course, yellow is the opposite color of violet, so it gives a boldness to the image. We see like lightnings in the background, obviously referring to the lightning bolt, wielded by Zeus. It also, obviously we will come to the wheel and the figures on the wheel, but a lot of this card is about the idea of picturing the universe as something in constant dynamic motion, something that's rotating and revolving and transforming. So the universe as a dynamic but balanced phenomenon. All right, so then on the wheel, this is like the wheel of fortune. This is a very classical image. This idea of fortune being like a wheel, that you're raised up and then lowered again, and that's just sort of the way of things. That fortune waxes and wanes. And some people get more of the waxing, and then some people get more of the waning. Some people experience both. Everyone experiences both. At different stages of the life. But it's not so much about the idea of like a divine reward or anything like that for punishment, but just the way the way that existence is. And so in this wheel here, Crowley's adapted the traditional depictions of the tarot card. And so we've got the three figures here that, in a slightly confusing way, Crowley attributes to what are called the three gunas. Three gunas, many of you are probably familiar with this idea already. It's taken from the Samkhya philosophy. The idea that there are these three qualities is almost not really even the right word, but I can't think of a better one. But they're like, kind of aspects, not substances, but something even subtler than that, that make up all created things, make up Prakriti. And so you can think of kind of modes or something like that. And so you have tamas, which is associated with darkness and heaviness and slowness. It's often in our tradition, it's associated with the alchemical element of salt. Then you have rajas, which is fiery and dynamic and hot, associated with desire. And in our tradition, we associate that with the alchemical element of sulfur. And then you have sattva, which is like pure and clear and balanced, harmonious. And often associated with like spiritual states of kind of withdrawal from, entrapment in desire or in matter. And that gets associated with the alchemical element of mercury. And so our three figures here correspond to the gunas, though, as Crowley talks about in a kind of complicated way. So the Sphinx at the top with the sword refers to sulfur. And Crowley says, this is only a momentary position. This Sphinx isn't like ruling over the card, but has just momentarily come to the top of the wheel before being inevitably, plunged back down again. On the left side, we see, Crowley refers to this god here as Hermanubis, who's a kind of Greco-Egyptian syncretic god of Hermes and Anubis, is a sort of psychopomp deity. But Crowley's really depicted the god here as simian in nature, which Hermanubis isn't depicted as. So so this might be more the Indian god like Hanuman, who Crowley does associate with Mercury. So I'm a little bit confused there about how he's using the term Hermanubis and what he means there. I don't know if any of the sort of psychopomp association with Hermanubis is appropriate here. But anyways, we've got the element of Mercury, or the sattva guna. And then on the right, we've got, representing the tamas guna, we've got a form of Typhon. Typhon is a monster from the Greek mythology, who is at one point tries to storm Mount Olympus and is struck by Zeus's thunderbolts. So we have, again, with associated with Zeus and with the lightning bolts there. There's some nice mythological tie-in with Typhon, but representing the guna of Tamas, and again it makes sense with the Titans, so they're kind of earthy and heavy, and sort of opposed to the right divine rule of the gods. Let's see. I guess we can just move on here. I feel like there was more I was going to say about that. But whenever I think of this card now, I always think of, if you're familiar with Carmina Burana, especially like the first piece there, O Fortuna. I always think of that, and that's a very nice. If you can listen to that, or read like an English translation of it, it's a nice presentation of some of the classical ideas about the way that fortune as a wheel is portrayed. I've struggled, honestly, of all the attributions of the tarot cards to the letters. This is one I've honestly struggled with a little bit. Jupiter, the planet, especially like in a more traditional or classical presentation of Jupiter, is like good fortune, right? Whereas this is something much more neutral and is about fortune, just as the sort of ups and downs of fortune, which again, there's a kind of relationship there, but it is something very different than planetary Jupiter. If you were just going to kind of associate this with any planet, I would almost think the moon might make more sense. But of course, actually, I'm not suggesting actually changing the attributions, but some of the like lunar association and the idea of like waxing and waning and rising and falling, there is some of that symbolism here. And actually in Or Fortuna, there's actually fortune is compared to the moon, waxing and waning and always changing. So be prepared for some of that kind of symbolism here. Though again, I think if we sort of look back at the 32nd, the 21st path of wisdom there, the idea of, let's see, how did it put it? The divine influx, bestowing its blessings to all things that exist, that maybe even, what to us look like, the ups and downs of fortune, good fortune and bad fortune, could in a higher sense be conceived of as entirely, benefic, if we could see beyond the limitations of our ego perspective, maybe. So maybe it's pointing to a higher understanding of that rather than just a kind of astrological association of Jupiter with good fortune. But anyways, interesting things to contemplate there. Oh, and this is Lamed. I didn't change. I reused the slide from before. But yeah, so this is Lamed here. This will be our last letter that we'll talk about today. Lamed is a single letter, so we know that it will be attributed to one of our signs of the zodiac. The hieroglyphic origin of this letter was a little bit confusing. So it's possibly from a hieroglyph meaning goad, though I found a number of different hieroglyphs that seem to mean that. And anyways, we'll get into it here. Anyways, that becomes the Phoenician letter there, which also means goad. Its sound is essentially equivalent to the English letter L and the L sound. And so, yeah, so our equivalent is just sort of straightforwardly L. And it has a value of 30. Again, we're counting by tens now. Spelled in full, it's spelled Lamed Mem Daleth, which sums to 74. Yeah, not a particularly significant letter, but you could look into it. Or a particularly significant number, I mean. All the letters are significant. Now, as a hieroglyph, it means sort of goad, or actually as a word, lamed, this Hebrew word actually does mean goad. It's often specifically given as ox goad. Now, the idea of the goad here is something, it's like there's different forms of it, sometimes more like a crook, sometimes a stick with like a point at the end, something that used to goad or to move, cattle, especially oxes around. There's also a number of derived meanings from the idea of goad, like to teach, to learn, to study, with different pointings. It can mean a disciple. All these are derived from the idea of goading, right, which is, makes sense for what a teacher does to a student, right, is he goads them. Into progressing and developing and learning. But also this idea of ox goad gives Lamed a special relationship to the letter Aleph, which, as we saw, has the hieroglyphic meaning ox. And so Aleph and Lamed are the ox and the ox goad. Now, Aleph and Lamed together also spell the divine name El. And then this is also, like Liber El, the book of the law. And there's also this idea of El as God, and then La, Lamed Aleph, meaning the not. And so this is something that Crowley really takes up and develops the thelemic significance of this idea of like God being the same as the zero. But again, this involves the letter Aleph and Lamed, the ox and the ox goad, the life force and the thing that gives it sort of direction and structure. And so there's a lot there that's really worth meditating on. And I think we'll probably come back to that maybe once or twice as we go through some of the other significances here. All right, so we've got our 32 paths of wisdom. So this is our 22nd path now. The 22nd path is the faithful intelligence, and is so called because by it spiritual virtues are increased, and all dwellers on earth are nearly under its shadow. And then Kaplan gives 22, faithful consciousness. It is called this because spiritual powers are increased through it, so that they can be close to all who dwell in their shadow. This dwelling in the shadow is another reference to the 91st Psalm, which we saw a reference to that, I think, 2 weeks ago. So interesting that reference is coming back again. Yeah, let's move on from there. So here it is on the Tree of Life. It connects Gevurah to Tefereth. Interestingly, in the David Shoemaker's Living Thelema episode, where he talks about, I think it's like the ordeals of AA. I think he talks about it, but he talks a lot about the path symbolism of the different AA grades. He has some very interesting things to say about how the path of Lamed is the like Adeptus Minor in Tefereth. In moving to the grade of Adeptus Major in Gevurah, it has to traverse like the path of Lamed and the path of Balance. So that's something you can look into if you haven't heard that recently. All right, so for our Yetzirah attribution, it's a single letter, so we know it's going to be one of the signs of the zodiac, and this is Libra. Now, Libra is the scales or the balances, or the balance. Now, often, the glyph and the meaning of it just refer to like an inanimate object, but I think it also makes sense to think of this as like a person, or like holding scales. And since the air signs are all considered to be the humane or human signs, well, the air signs plus Virgo are usually considered to be the human signs rather than like the animal signs. And so I think it makes more sense if we remember that this is someone holding scales, that this is a human sign and not, just an inanimate object. All right, so it's a yang or diurnal sign. It's a cardinal sign, and it's air. So this is cardinal air, so representing the the influx, or not influx, but the beginning or the initial movement of air here. So it's the domicile of Venus, and Saturn is also exalted here. So again, if we want to think of this is like the day house of Venus. We think of this as Venus in her more active mode. We saw with Taurus, that was like Venus in her nighttime house. And that's a more passive form of Venus, where that's more about, when you think of Taurus, you think of, wanting to, be on your couch, wanting to be comfortable, have, nice foods and things like that, like sensual pleasures, bodily pleasures. That's a sort of Venus at nighttime. But then Venus during the day, we can think of like relationships and harmony and social relationships. The air signs are often very social, very conversational. And Venus is interested in harmony and balance and good relationships. So this is like Venus in a more active mode of going out and establishing relationships and establishing harmony. And again, the idea of the cardinal sign here also carries some of that significance of like establishment and going out and doing and having, where things like, the mutable signs, the fixed signs are often just sort of doing their thing, that they just do all the time. They're kind of steady and fixed. The mutable signs are about like responding and changing conditions, where we can think of the cardinal signs as like having a plan and wanting to go in and create a certain situation. So as cardinal air and the domicile of Venus, we think about this as, creating harmony, fairness, justice. Let's see, I've got some other keywords here. Let's see, balancing, social, often a focus on others. A dynamic, contrarian, intellectual, seeking, exploring, aesthetic, design, composition, ratio. These are all sort of Venusian things, right? Of aesthetics and art. But especially thinking about balance and about air as related to multiplicity, that design and harmony. Design and ratio make a lot of sense. Composition. Libra is usually said to be reasonable, non-dogmatic. Libran people sometimes said to have trouble making decisions, right? And again, it's because of this idea of balancing and seeing different sides, and seeing, just the sort of balance between things. If you do that a lot, that can obviously be difficult to choose one thing over another because you have such a balanced perspective. And again, the sun in Libra is in its detriment, right? Is in the opposite, or in its fall, in the opposite sign to its exaltation in Aries. And one way of thinking about why the sun would be somewhat unhappy in Libra is that because Libra is so much about balance and about establishing like harmony with others, but the sun is very much about the self, the kind of the radiance of the self, that the sun's what the sun tries to do is somewhat impeded by being in Libra. The sun wants to focus on the individuality in some sense, and Libra wants to focus on other people. So there's a little bit of a kind of mismatch there in the goals. Saturn is also exalted in Libra, and as I understand the exaltations, this does not necessarily give Libra like a Saturnian quality. It's just that Saturn would be like particularly happy in Libra and would function particularly well. I've actually seen people talk about the idea that Saturn in Libra is sort of better and stronger than, or more desirable than Saturn in either Capricorn or Aquarius, the two signs that Saturn rules. And one way of trying to think about, why would Saturn like being in Libra, or why would Saturn function well in Libra, is that because Libra is about fairness and justice and balance, and Saturn is often about rules and imposing rules of a rulership, and these kind of heavy structures and structures that like we find ourselves inside, or structures that we find ourselves constrained by, that if those things are produced in conformity with justice and fairness and balance, they're going to be a lot more successful. A just ruler is probably going to have a better and more successful reign than an unjust ruler. All right, so for our magical weapon here, we have the Cross of Equilibrium. Now, it seems to me, and the things that Crowley says about this here is, I wouldn't think of this as being like an actual object of like a cross. We could think of it maybe as like an equal-armed cross, but I think the way Crowley talks about the Cross of Equilibrium is he says that it's something like it's visible in the arrangement of all of the furniture of the temple. And so again, as we've talked about before, we have with all of the zodiacal signs and their magical weapons, the idea that these are like either specific like items related to the furnishing of the temple or the conditions of the temple. And so here that we can think of the Cross of Equilibrium being just the kind of symmetrical and balanced arrangement of the temple and of like the objects on your altar. And if you ever had the fortune or misfortune of setting up a temple space with another group of ceremonial magicians, you will see the Cross of Equilibrium in great effect. Ceremonial magicians, in my experience, have been extremely concerned with establishing symmetry and of getting everything arranged. The items in a temple, furniture, things on the altars, of getting everything just perfectly balanced and arranged. And that is definitely, I think, what is meant here by the Cross of Equilibrium. So it's interesting to sort of think of that as a magical power. All right, so for tarot here, we've got the 8th Atu. Now remember that Atus are sort of out of order here because of the exchange that happened between the 8th and 11th Atus, what we've talked about before. So now we're kind of going back to Atu 8 in a sense, just like last week we went forward to Atu 11 associated with Teth. All right, so this is Atu 8. Crowley calls it adjustment, though it's more classically known as justice. And it also corresponds with the 2, 3, and 4 of swords, right? So the 3 decans of Libra. For a perfume or incense, we have galbanum again, mainly as an incense of air. Crowley also reads into galbanum, or smells into galbanum, I guess. The idea that there's something somewhat like sinister or almost evil in galbanum, and this he takes as related to the Saturnian kind of quality, the exaltation of Saturn. Though I don't know if he's just, I don't know. You can make of that what you will, but I think the main idea here is just galbanum as an instance of air. And obviously, Libra is an air sign. All right, so for our magical powers, we have works of justice and equilibrium. So you can really see this theme of equilibrium is becoming quite clear here. And, a lot of that coming just straight out of the symbolism of Libra. All right, for our color scales, for our king scale, we've got emerald green. We've already seen the color emerald green associated with Venus. And so I think that's the main way we can understand this here. Is just, this is Venus's house, and we've got one of the colors of Venus. Now in the queen scale, we've got blue. In the and again, this is just sort of the queen scale is the colors derived from from color theory. So we've just got the blue there. In the prince scale, again, this is the prince scales are usually at least an approximate mixture of the king and queen scales. So from emerald green and blue, we've got a deep blue green. And then finally, in the princess scale, we've got a pale green. Yeah, well, let's move on. All right, so for animals, Crowley gives two animals here, which are both interesting and not immediately obvious, though I think they do both work quite well, and that's the elephant and the spider. So the idea of the elephant, again, this might seem very different than sort of Venus and air, something like light and balance. The elephant is extremely, earthy and solid and heavy. And we talked about elephants as a possible animal attributed to Taurus. But now we have an elephant for a very different reason. This is the elephant as like the mythological beast that like bears the world, on its back. And so the idea here is the elephant as like a foundation, and that the idea that balance and the stability and harmony of balance is like the foundation of things, or is the foundation, upon which the world is built. I think that's how we get elephant here. And then for spider, the idea is of the spider's web as a thing of symmetry and as a thing of balance. I tried to pick a web here that is quite symmetrical. You can really see all the many lines of symmetry there. And so the spider as making a symmetrical thing works very well. The spider web seems to work nicely for air. It's something kind of sensitive. All the pieces of it are connected together. And I don't know. The spider web. I like that correspondence. All right, for plants, we have aloe, probably especially aloe vera. But Crowley just gives aloe. I mean, there's hundreds of species of aloe. I've got there, that's from a Roman, was the Juliana Anicia Codex. It's a Roman codex from, I think it was like the 6th century or so. It's an illustration of aloe there. I wasn't really clear on why aloe is being used. Aloe has a lot of healing properties. It's used for a number of different people probably are most familiar with it now as like being something used to treat like, cuts or burns. Also used for skin rejuvenation and things like that. Anciently, it was also used internally as like a purgative or a laxative. I'm not clear on why it would be attributed to Lamed here. If anyone has any thoughts about that, I'd be happy to hear it. But that's what Crowley gives. And Crowley says that this attribution is traditional. So he's obviously getting it from an older source. I'm not sure what it would be. Possibly like Agrippa or Francis Barrett, but I hadn't looked into it. And then for stones, we've got the emerald. Again, this is the emerald we already saw as a stone associated with Venus. And so it's just here again as Venus. All right, and then some deities here. We've got the Greek deity Thamus, who's pictured above there. Thamus is actually a titan, and is the titan of like law and justice. Sometimes also associated with oracles. She's associated with the Delphic oracle, and the idea there is not just of the oracular quality or prophetic quality, but especially with the idea of like an oracle as the giver of law, and especially like the first or kind of primordial law. I think is the idea here, and that associates her, in this idea of justice and law being associated with Libra. We also have 3 other Greek, not exactly deities, but Greek figures there, which is Minos. That's King Minos, who turns things into gold by touching them. Also Icus and Rhadamanthus. These 3 are all mortal kings who, and 2 of them are I think Rhadamanthus is the brother of Minos, I believe. And so after their deaths, they become the judges of the dead in Hades. And so it's there specifically as the judges in Hades. Oh, you're right. That's Midas, not Minos. Thanks. I knew that sounded funny as I was saying it. You're absolutely right. Forget that part. But Minos is a Greek king. Okay, and then for Egyptian deities, we have Ma'at. Ma'at is a really complex deity. We've seen Ma'at before. Yeah, we've seen Ma'at before, associated with air, and with well, actually, never mind. Yeah, forget. Oh yeah, thanks. Some conversation here about Minos and Midas. Yes. Yeah, thanks. I was just mixing up the names. Thank you. Yeah, actually, I don't think we did talk about Ma'at, but anyways, we'll talk about her now. So yeah, Ma'at is sort of a complex deity, and is not just like a goddess, but is also very much like a principle. And so the goddess in many ways is kind of like the embodiment of the principle of Ma'at. And so rather than try to explain it, I'm just going to read to you from, this is from Geraldine Pinch's book, Egyptian Mythology. So I'm just going to read her entry here on Ma'at, because I think she explains it better than I could. All right, so Ma'at. The central concept of Egyptian cosmology and ethics was personified as the goddess Ma'at, wearing an ostrich feather on her head. The word Ma'at can mean truth, justice, righteousness, order, balance, and cosmic law. The goddess Ma'at was the beloved daughter of Ra, the creator's sun god. She traveled with him in the sun bark, delighting his heart and giving life to his nostrils. The primary duty of an Egyptian king was to be the champion of Ma'at. In the afterlife, the dead were judged on whether they had done and spoken Ma'at. From the Old Kingdom onward, Ma'at's presence was thought to be vital to the daily regeneration of the sun god. In underworld books, she is often shown standing close to Ra in both the day and night boats of the sun. This, or the dual nature of Egypt as two kingdoms, may explain why Ma'at can appear as two identical goddesses. Ma'at shared her feather emblem with the air god Shu. She was sometimes equated with Shu's sister, Tefnut. The gods were said to live on Ma'at, and the goddess was identified with the basics of life: air to breathe, bread to eat, and beer to drink. From the 14th century BCE onward, Ma'at was often shown as a winged goddess. Like Isis, she could revive the dead, and with the air generated by her beating wings. Another emblem of Ma'at was a plinth sign that she used in the writing of her name. Such plinths are shown below the thrones of deities who act as divine judges. This depiction has been interpreted as a symbol that Ma'at was the base on which Egyptian society was built. Kings were frequently shown offering a miniature figure of Ma'at to the chief deity of a temple. All the daily rituals and sacrifices would be deemed meaningless unless the king and his people were living righteous lives. Judges and high officials wore images of the goddess to signify that they were enforcing her laws. Ma'at was often linked with Thoth, the impartial judge, who was said to have put the laws of Ma'at into writing. This gave a divine precedent for the many works of Egyptian literature that teach or debate how to live in Ma'at in the real world. Egyptian myths of a golden age included a period when Ma'at was ruler of earth. She was sometimes said to have withdrawn to the heavens because she was grieved by the wicked behavior of humanity. Ma'at could still be thought of as living with the individual, like his or her good angel, and accompanying that person into the afterlife. Eventually, joining Ma'at became a euphemism for dying. In the Book of the Dead, the Hall of Two Truths, or the Hall of Double Ma'at, is the place where the souls of the dead come to be judged. The hearts of the dead were weighed against the feather of Ma'at, and her image sometimes surmounts the scales. If, like Ra, the dead person had Ma'at in his or her heart, the scales would balance and the deceased would be declared true of voice or justified. A hymn from the time when Egypt was occupied by the Persians evokes the beautiful face of Ma'at, shining from the heart of Ra. The goddess is urged to reside in the tongue and head of the Persian king so that he will do Ma'at. During the Greco-Roman period, Ma'at seems to have lost her central place in Egyptian religion, and some of her functions were taken over by Isis. So anyways, I just wanted to sort of get in that idea of the symbolism of the feather, the relation to the judgment of the dead scene, and also Ma'at as an abstract concept of related to things like law and justice and balance, though not being exactly a translation of any of those words exactly. All right, and then we'll look at the magical hierarchy of Libra. So for our Atsaluthic name, again, because it's a zodiacal sign, we'll have one of the 12 banners of the name. So one of the permutations of the Tetragrammaton. So this is Vav He Yod He. And then alternate divine name, this is a divine name of Venus. We have Yod-He, Vav-He, Zavaoth, which you could also use as an alternative name. Then we have the Archangel of Libra, which is Zuriel. Then the angel ruling the house, angel ruling Libra of Yahel. And then the lesser assistant angel in the sign, which is Kadkiel. Then we also have the Heaven of Messiah, which is just the Hebrew name for the constellation Libra, and that of Mazanim. All right, and then I also wanted to show you, again, kind of like we did with the Libra Yod, I just wanted to show you like Liber Librae. This is another document that's very particularly associated with the symbolism of one letter. So Liber Librae means like the book of the balance, and it's under the figure 30, right? And Lamed is the value of 30. So this book is very much, we could give it as kind of attributed to the letter Lamed, and so much of it is expressive of the nature of Lamed and of balance and sort of not moral rightness, but of sort of being in harmony with things and in acting in a way that is, that is beneficial or appropriate to to your own will and to the situation. These types of ideas. All right, so I've grabbed this. If you haven't read it before, this is a great document to read and reread and kind of study and meditate on. But I've grabbed just a few verses from it that most directly are most directly relevant for the symbolism of the letter. All right, so I'll just read those. So verse 0, learn first, O thou who aspirest unto our ancient order, that equilibrium is the basis of the work. If thou thyself hast not a sure foundation, whereon wilt thou stand to direct the forces of nature? So again, we see a little bit of that connection back to the idea of the elephant, and the idea of balance as the foundation. Which is also interesting, foundation in Hebrew, of course, is yesod, and so we could think about, some of the significances of the sephira yesod. That's another interesting thing to think about. All right, but we'll just go on here. Know then that as man is born into this world amidst the darkness of matter and the strife of contending forces, so must his first endeavor be to seek the light through their reconciliation. So now we have this idea of reconciliation of the contending forces. Remember that unbalanced force is evil, that unbalanced severity is but cruelty and oppression, but that also unbalanced mercy is but weakness which would allow and abet evil. Act passionately, think rationally, be thyself. Therefore, as hath already been said, establish thyself firmly in the equilibrium of forces, in the center of the cross of the elements, that cross from whose center the creative word issued in the birth of the dawning universe. So again, the symbol of cross, we have again, not just cross as a symbol of balance. We also think about that idea of the cross of equilibrium as like the weapon of Libra here. All right, and then last verse that I pulled out, not the last verse of the document though. Be thou therefore prompt and active as the sylphs, but avoid frivolity and caprice. Be energetic and strong like the salamanders, but avoid irritability and ferocity. Be flexible and attentive to images like the undines, but avoid idleness and changeability. Be laborious and patient like the gnomes, but avoid grossness and avarice. So in all of these things, we see balance in different forms, both the balance of, like, I think we see that especially in the last verse that I read there, where it's not just balance in the sense of developing all 4 elemental qualities, but of developing each elemental qualities in a balanced way, where, for the sylphs, the air spirits, they can be, are prompt and active, and you should develop those powers. But if unbalanced, they become, frivolous and capricious. And so you sort of avoid those qualities. So not just balancing by developing all 4, but developing each one on its own in a balanced way. So we can see balance at all different, kind of scales or layers of resolution, I guess you could say. Yeah, okay, so we just got a few minutes left here, so we can spend last few minutes talking about our tower trump here. All right, so this is adjustment. Again, it was named Justice in older packs, and Crowley renamed it to adjustment. I think partially to underlie the idea that this is a cosmic principle, and that this isn't some kind of like human idea of justice, where like, people who break laws are punished or something like that. This is a cosmic principle, and also something appropriate for Thelema, that this is an amoral principle, that this isn't about obeying some, of course, the only law is do what thou wilt, but that in the operation of things, there is balance, and these sort of, something like a kind of justice, but not the human idea of justice. Crowley, even, when he talks about karma, always really emphasizes that karma doesn't have, sort of human moral qualities associated with it. So we could think of like the law of karma, as like the law of cause and effect. We could think of that being appropriate here. Interestingly, it's something I've noticed, and I've heard a few other people talk about, the idea of that, karma as a more amoral thing, that karma isn't about, people being sort of punished for their, if you're rude to someone, then later you have like someone's rude to you back as some sort of like karmic justice, or if you hurt people, then you suffer. That these are actually very much kind of like Judeo-Christian ideas being like placed on top of Indian ideas, and that karma, it really, for a lot of, I think, like kind of Western sort of New Age type people, karma became just a kind of replacement for the idea of like divine law or divine justice or divine punishment, but isn't actually like a new idea. And so here, I think it's just important to be careful that when we're talking about law and things like that, we're talking more about like the laws of physics or the laws of cause and effect, or even not necessarily like the laws of physics as like material laws, but as laws in that sense, like the law of gravity, rather than like the law of, not doing bad things, right? Okay, so let's look at a little bit of the symbolism here. The esoteric title here was the daughter of the Lords of Truth, the ruler of the balance. Interesting thing to do with the esoteric titles, you'll notice that in some of them, it's like several of the cards are depicted as being like the daughter of something. Actually, I don't think I mentioned it back when we looked at the Hermit, but the Hermit is one of several cards whose esoteric title involves like the magus of something. So you can kind of like look at the esoteric titles and then pull out those cards that have similar esoteric titles, like look at all the cards that are described as being the magus of something, and then kind of, pull those cards out and look at them as a group and think about, what types of things they have in common. That can just be an interesting way of trying to work with and get some stuff out of the esoteric titles, is by looking at the similarities or, kind of repetitions of formal patterns within the names. All right, so for our card here, we see that's Ma'at there, is our figure in the card. You can see she's got the double plumes. That's like kind of the Amun crown, but it's a double feather, a little bit different than the feather that we saw in the image of her a few minutes ago. We see a large pair of scales there, the balances, and that on them, we see the Greek letters alpha and omega, the first and last letters. Of course, alpha and omega are also used in a lot of Christian symbols, as the beginning and the end, as symbols of, absoluteness and totality. And we see that same sort of thing like in the alchemical word azoth. You see a lot of those same ideas about the first and last letters of the alphabet being, like the highest and the lowest, symbols of totality, completeness, balance. But here, very, very especially is balance. Let's see. She's carrying a sword here. This is not only like the sword of justice. Also, the sword is an air weapon, and the scales are very often associated with the sword, or are kind of like balanced on the point of a sword. So that's a common symbolic association. The various spheres here represent, kind of like harmony and balance. Crowley talks about the four main spheres, and I'm not sure if he means like in the corners or like the groups of four, like either above or below her, as the fourness there representing like Hesed and the idea of law. Four is often associated in Kabbalah with the idea of law and with balance. So a lot of that symbolism here as well. Let's see, she is she's masked here. And I guess also maybe by her outfit, Crowley talks about her as being like a form of harlequin. And so again, this is this association with Aleph, where Aleph is the fool, Libra is like the harlequin. And again, setting up that relationship between those two letters, which is really worth like looking into and meditating on. And Crowley even tried to put some of that relationship right here in the card. But I think, it's you can see the color scales here as well that we looked at, the blues and greens. But I think, the overall impression of the card is really of great balance and symmetry. You can obviously see that in the layout, that there's, both horizontal and vertical symmetry. There's the scales, everything is balanced there. And you really get the idea of this like perfect precision of balance. You can see the way that she's kind of like standing on tiptoe with the sword like right between her legs there, which is obviously incredibly precarious but precise. A balance, and again, not just of like justice, but of the balance of things and the precision of that balance. Crowley refers to her as a dancer, and I thought that symbolism worked really nice. That could be a nice sort of symbolism for Libra. Could be like a dancer. It's Venusian, and so related to like the arts and to expression, and also dance as. The idea like dancers as associated with air makes a lot of sense. Very, like light on their feet. Moving up into the air, or even just in the way that like ballet dancers move. There's an airy, kind of active, very mobile quality that makes a lot of sense. So I like thinking of Ma'at here, on the adjustment card as like a dancer, and having all the balance and grace and precision of a dancer. I think of also the ideas about like the idea of Maya, the dance of the world, or the veil, the kind of the weaving of the veil, that it's the ongoing like conditions of life and the ups and down and back and forth, that there's something of like a dance in these qualities. And again, I think that again relates to the Fool in a very nice way, where the Fool, we can talk about the creation as something a bit sort of whimsical or foolish in a way. The Harlequin, as the kind of dancer here, seems to balance that out very nicely. And relate to it in a really nice way. And again, I think express some of the thelemic ideas or thelemic kind of philosophy of life here. Although we are, of course, like cultivating, like balance and rightness, there's also something like lighter and more joyful and more playful about it. Let's see, Jason asks if the diamond shape is an emerald or something else. Crowley talks about it as being like a kind of veiled form of the Vesica Pisces, or the Vesica Piscis, I guess would be better pronounced, which is a feminine symbol. I'm trying to remember what else he says about that. Well, this is where basically at the end of the class here as well. So I can look that up real quick. Actually, I've got the Book of Thoth right here with me. I'm trying to remember what he says. But yeah, that basically wraps up for today. Let's see, what does he say? I'm not finding it now, but it is in there. So yeah, if you check out the Book of Thoth, you can find that discussion in there. And Kristen's saying that diamonds are associated with harlequins as well. I wasn't aware of that association. That's really interesting, Kristen. Okay, but yeah, that wraps up our class for today. For more info about our work, you can visit tots.org and /FAQ. There's my email address there if you'd like to get in touch with me. As I said, I know I owe at least one person here an email. You'll hear from me soon. Just a little behind on things lately. We do have a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member. If you are a member of the academic or initiatory track, you already contribute to our work, but we do have a $5 suggested donation for anyone else in attendance, and you can send that via PayPal to payments@tots.org. Just sort of moving along fairly steadily with our letters here, and next week we'll pick it back up with the letter Mem. and talk about a couple of really interesting tarot cards next week too. So next week should be a really interesting session. But yeah, thanks everybody. And hope you're all, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to hang out for a couple more minutes, but yeah, hope you're all doing well, staying healthy out there, and see you.